At my father's 60th birthday, everyone clapped when my brother gave him a Rolex. When it was my turn, I handed Dad a framed photo, something I'd spent months restoring. Later that night, I found it in the trash. My brother smirked. Guess Dad didn't like charity gifts. He didn't know the real gift wasn't the photo. It was what I'd hidden behind it. My name is Clara Jennings, and at 37, I had become a ghost at my own family's table. The venue for my father's 60th birthday was the Governor's Oak in Ridgefield, New Hampshire, a place that reeked of old money and new ambition. The air was thick with the scent of leather, expensive perfume, and the simmering aroma of roasted duck. Dark wood paneling absorbed the low hum of conversation, the clinking of heavy silverware on porcelain, and the forced laughter that characterized every Jennings family gathering. It was an atmosphere of meticulously curated success, a stage set for a performance I was no longer a part of. Just 2 weeks prior, I had been escorted out of the Jennings & Sons law firm, the firm bearing my own last name, with a cardboard box containing a dying desk plant and 10 years of my life. My termination papers, signed by my father, cited a vague and insulting lack of professional alignment. The truth was, I had been fired by my own family for having the audacity to uncover a truth they preferred to keep buried. Tonight, however, was not about me. It was about Dad, and more specifically, it was about my brother, Mark. The room revolved around him like a planet around its sun. At 40, Mark was the personification of everything our father valued: confident, ruthlessly charming, and male. He was the Sons in Jennings & Sons, the designated heir, the golden child. I watched from the periphery as he held court, a glass of scotch in one hand, the other clapping shoulders and shaking hands. Snippets of praise drifted towards me, each one a small, sharp sting. Mark, that closing on the Ridgefield development was masterful. A local councilman boomed, "Your father must be so proud." My father was indeed proud. He stood beside Mark, his posture straighter, his smile wider than I'd seen it in years. He looked at my brother with an open, uncomplicated adoration he had never once directed at me. When the time for gifts arrived, the performance reached its crescendo. Mark presented a small, heavy box wrapped in dark green paper. Inside was a Rolex. It wasn't just a watch. It was a statement, a gleaming gold and steel symbol of legacy, of time, of succession. The room erupted in a chorus of oohs and ahs. My father's face, already beaming, seemed to light up from within. He clasped Mark's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You are a true Jennings, son. You understand what it takes to build something that lasts." Then, it was my turn. The applause died down, and a polite, expectant silence fell over the room. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, the disgraced daughter, the failed lawyer. My hands were cold as I walked forward, holding my gift. It was a large, flat rectangle wrapped in simple brown paper. Compared to the Rolex, it looked humble, almost pathetic. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He took it from me, his touch brief and impersonal. He tore the paper away to reveal a heavy, dark walnut frame. Inside, behind pristine museum-grade glass, was a photograph. It was a family portrait from 1993, taken in our backyard on a sunny afternoon. My father, younger and with more hair, stood with his arm around my mother. Mark, a gangly teenager, was trying to look cool and disinterested, and there I was, a little girl with a gap-toothed smile, holding my mother's hand. Mom. She was the heart of the picture, her laugh so vivid you could almost hear it. The original photograph had been a casualty of a leaky attic, faded and water-damaged. I had spent 3 months and a significant portion of my severance pay having it professionally restored. Every crack was mended, every faded color brought back to life. It was, I thought, a piece of our shared soul, a reminder of a time when we were a family, not a corporation. My father looked at it for a moment. His expression was unreadable. He gave a short, perfunctory nod. "Thank you, Clara. Very thoughtful." He didn't look me in the eye. He set the frame down on the gift table without a second glance and immediately turned back to the crowd, lifting his wrist to flash the new Rolex. "Now, look at the craftsmanship on this," he announced, his voice booming with renewed enthusiasm. The conversation surged back to life, leaving me in a silent, cold wake. The moment of my offering, the months of my effort, had been dismissed in less than 10 seconds. I retreated to my seat, my cheeks burning with a familiar shame. The party wound down slowly. The laughter became more sporadic, the conversations shorter. Guests began to leave, offering their final congratulations. I stayed behind, an old habit from a lifetime of being the dutiful daughter. While the restaurant staff cleared the main tables, I gathered discarded napkins and empty gift boxes, a subconscious attempt to make myself useful, to find a purpose in a room where I no longer had one. I picked up a large black trash bag left by the gift table, heavy with wrapping paper and ribbon. As I tied it shut, my eyes caught a glimpse of something familiar inside. It was the dark walnut frame. My gift. It was lying face down on a pile of soiled napkins and leftover scraps of chocolate cake. A smear of buttercream obscured my mother's smile. One corner of the heavy wood was splintered, and a thin crack spiderwebbed across the protective glass. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The air in my lungs turned to ice. It wasn't just a discarded gift. It was a verdict. It was the complete and utter nullification of my effort, my sentiment, my place in this family. Looking for something. I looked up. Mark was standing there, leaning against a pillar with that infuriatingly smug smirk on his face. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the picture of casual cruelty. "Guess Dad didn't like charity gifts," he said, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Clara, next time, try giving something with value." I said nothing. There were no words. The humiliation was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I could feel my blood pounding in my ears, a hot, furious tide rising within me. My entire life, I had tried to earn my father's approval through hard work and loyalty, while Mark had simply been handed it by virtue of his birth. I had followed the rules, and he had rewritten them to his benefit. And when I had discovered just how much he was rewriting them, funneling client funds into a secret account, I was the one who was punished, cast out to protect the precious heir. My silence seemed to amuse him. He chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a lost cause. "Don't worry. Dad will find a spot for you somewhere. Maybe in PR. You were always good with words." He pushed himself off the pillar and walked away, leaving me alone with the trash. He didn't know. He couldn't possibly know. He looked at the frame and saw a cheap, emotional gesture. He had no idea that the thing of value he so prized was nestled right inside it. He thought he was looking at a failed attempt to buy affection. He was actually looking at his own damnation. My hands stopped shaking. A cold, clarifying calm washed over me. The pain in my chest didn't disappear, but it crystallized into something hard and sharp purpose. I reached into the trash can, my fingers carefully avoiding the sticky cake residue. I lifted the heavy frame out. It felt different in my hands now. It was no longer a peace offering. It was a weapon. The photo of my mother, even smeared with frosting, seemed to look at me with knowing eyes. This gift was never about sentiment. It was a test, a carefully calculated experiment to see where my father's loyalty truly lay. I had given him a choice, a symbol of our family's past, restored with love, or a symbol of Mark's corrupt future, bought with stolen money. He had made his choice without a moment's hesitation, and now I had my answer. I held the frame, the weight of it a solid comfort. Tucked behind the restored photograph and its thick cardboard backing was a slim, high-capacity USB drive. On it was a pristine, encrypted copy of every illegal transaction, every fake invoice, and every manipulated client fund statement Mark had ever created. All the evidence I had copied from the firm's server in my final hour. The very evidence my father had fired me to suppress. I slowly, deliberately, wiped the frosting off the glass with a clean napkin. Then, I slid the frame into my large leather handbag. The satisfying click of the clasp closing echoed in the quiet room. Mark was wrong. I had given my father something of immense value. He had just thrown away the wrong gift. The drive home from the restaurant was a silent, 20-minute journey through the sleeping streets of suburban New Hampshire. The weight of the walnut frame on the passenger seat beside me was a tangible presence, a solid block of resentment in the darkness of my car. Each red light was a pause, a moment for another memory to surface, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. My father's world had always been one of simple, brutal binaries, light and shadow, strong and weak, profit and loss. For as long as I could remember, he had governed our lives with his favorite piece of fireside wisdom, a mantra repeated at dinner tables and holiday gatherings: sons inherit the world, daughters keep the home. It wasn't meant to be cruel. In his mind, it was the natural order of things, as immutable as gravity. He saw it as a blueprint for a stable, successful family. I saw it as the architectural plan for my cage. This philosophy manifested in every choice he made for us. When it came time for college, Mark's tuition to a respectable state university was paid without a second thought, a necessary investment in the firm's future. My ambition to attend a top-tier law school was treated as a charming but frivolous hobby. There was no tuition fund for the daughter. So, I fought. I worked my way through undergrad, studied until my eyes burned, and clawed my way into Columbia Law on a full academic scholarship. The pride I felt on acceptance day was mine alone. My father's reaction was a placid, "Well, that's nice, dear. It will be good for you to have something to do." We graduated in the same year. Mark and I. His graduation party was a lavish affair, a coronation celebrating the arrival of the new Prince of Jennings and Sons. My own was a small dinner with a few friends. When I formally applied for a junior associate position at the firm, my father sat me down in his vast, mahogany-paneled office and explained, with infuriating gentleness, that there just wasn't a place for me. The firm, he said, had a certain culture, a certain path. It wasn't the right fit. It was the kindest, most devastating rejection of my life. The final seal on my exclusion was set in bronze letters the year after my mother died. Mom had been my advocate, the quiet force who believed my ambition was a virtue, not a novelty. With her gone, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. My father restructured the practice, moving it to a larger building downtown, and one morning, driving to the small, independent firm that had finally hired me, I saw the new sign being mounted on the granite facade, Jennings and Sons, not Jennings and Daughter, not even just Jennings Law. The and Sons was a declaration. It chiseled my father's primitive worldview into stone and metal for the entire world to see. I was not, and would never be, part of the legacy. I was an afterthought, a footnote in my own family story. Eventually, after 5 years of proving myself at another firm, he relented. Not with an offer to join the main office. Of course, that was sacred ground. Instead, he offered me a position as a compliance manager at a small satellite office 30 miles away. It was a glorified back-office role, a place for paperwork and problems he and Mark didn't want to deal with. I took it, convincing myself it was a foot in the door, a chance to finally prove my worth on my own terms. For years, I was the daughter who helps out. I was the one who managed the trusts, audited the accounts, and drafted the briefs for the firm's most complicated cases. My work was meticulous, my arguments airtight. I built the foundations, poured the concrete, and framed the houses. Mark's job was to show up at the end, turn the key in the door, and pose for the pictures. I remember the Harrison Trust case with a particular, searing clarity. It was a complex estate battle that hinged on a single, obscure precedent from a 1928 probate court ruling. I spent 3 weeks buried in the law library's archives, my fingers stained with dust from forgotten legal texts, until I found it. I drafted the entire motion, a 70-page document that systematically dismantled the opposition's case. Mark presented it in court. He read my words, used my logic, and won. The next day, his smiling face was on the front page of the local business journal, lauded for his brilliant legal mind. At a family dinner that Sunday, my father raised a glass. To Mark, he toasted, his voice booming with pride, for showing everyone what a Jennings lawyer is made of. I sat there, stirring my soup, my own brilliant mind a silent, uncredited ghostwriter at the table. That was the pattern. I did the work. He got the glory. And for a long time, I swallowed my bitterness and told myself that the success of the firm was what mattered. I was a Jennings, after all. But my role in compliance gave me a unique, unrestricted view of the firm's financial plumbing. And one Tuesday afternoon, while conducting a routine quarterly audit, I found a pipe that was leaking. It started as a small discrepancy, an expense reimbursement that didn't quite add up, a thread, out of professional obligation. I pulled on it. The thread led to a string, the string to a rope, and the rope to a hidden, internal account labeled only as contingency. It was a slush fund. Mark was using it to skim money from client trust accounts, not large amounts, just a few thousand here and there, enough to go unnoticed in the multi-million-dollar flows. He was using the money to pay unofficial commissions to local officials to expedite zoning permits, and, more disturbingly, to fund his own lavish lifestyle. As I dug deeper, a cold dread settled in my stomach. On several of the withdrawal authorizations, to add a layer of plausible deniability for himself, he had forged my signature. I felt sick. This wasn't just unethical. It was a felony. It could destroy the firm, ruin our clients, and land him in prison. My first instinct, my only instinct, was to go to my father. I printed everything: the transaction logs, the falsified invoices, the withdrawal slips with my forged signature. I organized them into a neat, undeniable folio of evidence and requested a private meeting. I laid the documents on the gleaming surface of his desk, the same desk where he had once told me I wasn't a good fit for his firm. I explained my findings calmly, logically, like the lawyer he had raised me to be. I expected shock, anger, disappointment in Mark. I was a fool. He didn't even look at all the pages. He listened to me with a growing, icy stillness. When I was finished, he folded his hands and looked at me, his eyes cold and hard. There was no concern for the clients, no outrage at the criminality. There was only a profound, chilling disappointment in me. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what are you trying to do? Are you trying to destroy this family?" "I'm trying to save it," I whispered, stunned. "Mark is breaking the law. He's putting everything you built at risk." "Mark is your brother," he countered, as if that explained everything. "He is the future of this firm. He may have been overzealous, but your job is to protect the family, not to attack it from within. You will drop this, immediately. This conversation never happened." 1 week later, I was called into HR and fired for a pattern of unprofessional conduct and creating a disruptive work environment. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. They had a security guard watch me pack my box. It was the ultimate humiliation, a public branding as a traitor. But as I sat at my desk for the last time, with the guard's shadow looming over me, I did one last thing, while pretending to delete personal files. I slipped a USB drive into the port. With my heart pounding against my ribs, I initiated a transfer, copying the entire encrypted folder containing the evidence against Mark. The progress bar moved with agonizing slowness. Every footstep in the hallway outside my office made me jump. But they were so arrogant, so sure of their power, that they never thought to check. They thought firing me was enough to silence me. I walked out of that building for the last time, a box of my belongings in my arms and a decade of their crimes on a tiny piece of plastic in my pocket. That drive needed a hiding place, somewhere no one would ever think to look. And what better place than behind a symbol of something they had already proven they considered worthless? The restored family photograph, a relic of a past they ignored, centered on a woman they'd forgotten. Given with a sentiment they despised was the perfect vessel. It was a Trojan horse built of my own pain. As I drove away from the restaurant, the streetlights flashing across my windshield. I clutched my handbag. The memories were no longer just a source of pain. They were affidavits. They were exhibits A through Z, in a case I was now ready to prosecute. My family had held a trial and passed their judgment on me long ago. They just didn't realize I was about to become the judge, jury, and executioner of my own appeal. Back in the sterile silence of my apartment, I placed the framed photograph on my clean, empty dining table. The splintered corner and the crack across the glass were no longer insults. They were artifacts of a successful experiment. The lingering ache of humiliation from the party was still there, a low thrum beneath my ribs, but it was being rapidly overtaken by something else, the cold, clean focus of a lawyer preparing for trial. My apartment, once a sanctuary from the family drama, was now a war room, and this photograph was the key to my entire strategy. With the careful precision of a surgeon, I retrieved a small toolkit from my desk. I laid a soft cloth on the table and gently placed the frame face down. The backing was held in place by a series of small, flexible metal tabs. I pried each one open, my movements deliberate and unhurried. The cardboard backing lifted away easily, and there, taped to the center of the board, nestled directly behind the image of my mother's smiling face, was the small black USB drive. It was exactly where I had left it. I peeled it from the tape, its plastic casing cool against my fingertips. This tiny object held the entire, unvarnished truth of Jennings & Sons. The numbers don't lie. That was the first lesson I'd learned in my compliance role, a truth as absolute as any legal statute. My father and brother saw my job as a bureaucratic necessity, a dusty corner of the firm where inconvenient rules were managed and then promptly forgotten. They never understood the power they had handed me. As compliance manager, I was granted temporary, high-level administrative access to every financial account, every project fund, every client trust. It was a necessary evil for them, required for me to perform the audits that kept the state bar satisfied. They saw it as a leash. They never imagined I would use it as a key. Mark was clever, but his cleverness was born of arrogance, not intelligence. He knew a direct transfer of funds from a client account would trigger immediate alarms. So, he created a loophole, a shadow ledger within the firm's own accounting system. He called it the J&S Internal Emergency Fund. On paper, its stated purpose was to provide rapid, no-questions-asked funding for urgent litigation expenses, expert witness retainers, last-minute court filings, unforeseen travel. It was a plausible idea, one that my father likely approved with a self-satisfied nod at his son's ingenuity. In reality, it was Mark's personal piggy bank and bribery machine. The mechanics were simple. He would authorize a transfer from a large, multi-million-dollar client trust account to the emergency fund, disguising it as a legitimate case expense. Once the money was in the internal fund, it was subject to far less scrutiny. From there, he could authorize payments for anything he wanted. A consulting fee of $10,000 to a city planning commissioner who conveniently approved a zoning variance for a lucrative real estate development. A research grant to a local politician's pet project, followed by a favorable government contract for the firm. These were his commissions, the grease that kept the wheels of his ambition turning. And then there was the personal theft, lavish dinners disguised as client entertainment, a down payment on a new boat, coded as a dispute resolution settlement. He was bleeding the firm's clients dry. One doctored invoice at a time. His greatest act of hubris, however, was in how he chose to cover his tracks. In any audit, the compliance manager's signature on an expense report was the gold standard, the final stamp of approval. Mark knew this. So, on more than a dozen of the most egregious transfers, he had used me. He had scanned a copy of my signature from a legitimate document and digitally appended it to his fraudulent payment authorizations. He was using my reputation for meticulousness and integrity as a shield for his own corruption. He was making me an unwilling accomplice to his crimes. If this ever unraveled, his plan was clear. He would claim the overzealous compliance manager must have made a mistake, or worse, that I was the one pulling the strings. When I was fired, Their relief must have been palpable. They thought they had cut out the cancer. They escorted me from the building, watched me pack my sad little box, and wiped their hands clean. They were so blinded by their own self-importance, so convinced of my weakness, that they made a fatal error in calculation. They assumed that the emotional, rejected daughter would leave with nothing but her wounded pride. They never conceived that the methodical, detail-obsessed lawyer would secure a complete, encrypted backup of their entire criminal enterprise before she walked out the door. They had forgotten who I was. I wasn't just Clara, the daughter. I was Clara Jennings, Esco, Columbia Law, and I knew how to build a case. The photograph, then, was the final piece of that case. It was the bait. I knew my father. I knew his disdain for sentimentality, his impatience with anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. I knew that in the grand theater of his birthday party, a restored photo from the daughter he'd just fired would be an inconvenience, an emotional complication in a day dedicated to celebrating his chosen son. I gambled on his cruelty. I gambled on the fact that he would not look closely. He would not take the frame to his office, would not open the back to replace the picture someday. He would see it as a worthless gesture from a worthless daughter. He would throw it away. His act of discarding it was the final confirmation I needed. It was his signature on a sworn affidavit, declaring his allegiance. He had chosen Mark. He had chosen the lie. That single act in the restaurant untangled the last knot of guilt in my heart, the lingering sense of familial duty, the faint hope that I could somehow fix this from the inside. All of it vanished when I saw that frame in the trash. My father had made his choice, and in doing so, he had set me free to make mine. I inserted the USB drive into my laptop. The files were all there, perfectly preserved. Spreadsheets, bank statements, scanned invoices, audio snippets from a meeting Mark had accidentally recorded on his phone. A mountain of cold, hard data. My plan began to form, not as a messy, emotional outburst, but as a series of logical, sequential steps. I could go to the authorities, of course, an anonymous tip, a package to the district attorney, but that felt too easy, too clean. It would let my father play the victim, the patriarch betrayed by a rogue son. It would allow the narrative to be controlled by others. No, that wasn't enough. I didn't want to destroy the family name, as my father had accused. I wanted to redefine it. I wanted to force them to live in the unfiltered glare of the truth they had spent a lifetime avoiding. To do that, the confession couldn't come from me. It had to come from them. Specifically, it had to come from Mark. The arrogant, untouchable heir had to be the architect of his own downfall. I wouldn't be the one to push him off the cliff. I would simply illuminate the path. Knowing his own hubris would make him run right over the edge. My work was done in the shadows, in the archives, in the numbers. Now, it was time for the stage. And I knew, with the certainty of a perfectly constructed legal argument, that Mark himself would provide the grand finale. All I had to do was set the scene. The week following my father's birthday was a study in stillness. I did not rage. I did not weep. I methodically dismantled the walnut frame, cataloged the USB drive as Exhibit A, and stored it in a fireproof safe. My grief had been processed, my anger distilled into a single, cold drop of purpose. The time for reaction was over. It was time to act. My first move in this quiet war would not be a salvo of accusations, but a carefully worded, perfectly polite email, a trap laid with a velvet glove. From a new anonymous email address, I began to type. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations." The body was even simpler, Mark. I just heard the final numbers on the Ridgefield development deal. A truly stunning success. You and Dad must be incredibly proud. It was well-deserved. See. I read it over a dozen times, analyzing every word. Stunning success fed his ego. You and Dad reinforced their exclusive alliance. Well-deserved was the poisoned cherry on top. The Ridgefield deal was the crown jewel of his recent accomplishments, and I knew from the files on my drive that it was also his most criminally compromised project. greased by at least 3 of the largest bribes he had ever paid from the slush fund. My congratulatory note was not an olive branch. It was a targeted probe, designed to elicit a specific response arrogance. I hit send, and the waiting began. It felt like launching a torpedo and listening on sonar for the impact. It took him less than an hour to reply. The response was everything I had hoped for. Thanks, Clara. You don't know the half of what it took to get that one over the line, but it's done. Dad's happy. That's what matters. A small, cold smile touched my lips. He was right. I didn't know the half of it. I knew all of it. I knew about the $20,000 expediting fee to the head of the zoning board, funneled through a shell corporation that didn't exist. I knew about the forged environmental impact report, and I knew that what matters was not my father's happiness, but Mark's insatiable greed. His condescending tone, the casual dismissal of my understanding, was perfect. He saw me as a naive outsider, a spectator. He was secure in his deception. Phase 2 required a shift in tactics, from subtle provocation to feigned vulnerability. 2 days later, I sent a second email. This one was longer, carefully constructed to sound adrift and defeated. I wrote about the difficulty of finding a position after being terminated from my previous role, the coded language of HR departments, the polite rejections. I painted a picture of a woman at a professional dead end. I ended the email with a hook designed to snag his savior complex. I know we've had our issues, I wrote, but you've always had a brilliant mind for strategy. I truly don't know how to navigate this. Any advice you could offer on how to get back into the industry would mean the world to me. I had just handed the narcissist a golden mirror, and I knew he wouldn't be able to resist looking into it. This time, his reply came in the form of a phone call. Clara, he said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity, I got your email. Don't worry. We're going to take care of you. I made sure to sound surprised and grateful. Mark, you don't have to. Nonsense, he interrupted. You're my sister. Dad and I were talking, and we feel it's important to show a united front. It doesn't look good for the family, you being out there on your own. He paused, letting the weight of his generosity settle. I've created a position, a short-term consulting contract. You can work from home. We need someone to review some of our older, closed case files. Just a bit of housekeeping, checking for compliance loose ends. It'll put something recent on your resume and show everyone that there's no bad blood. The irony was so potent it was almost comical. He was offering to pay me to investigate a version of his own crimes. So confident was he in his own cleverness. He saw this as an act of supreme benevolence, a way to control my narrative and keep me indebted to him. He had no idea he was inviting the fox not just into the henhouse, but into the security control room. I feigned hesitation, making him sell the idea a little harder. Finally, I agreed, my voice thick with contrived emotion. Mark, thank you. I don't know what to say. Don't mention it. I'll have HR send over the paperwork. There's just one thing, I said, my tone carefully casual. To do the job properly, to really cross-reference the old files with past billing, I'll need access to the archives, and probably temporary, read-only access to the accounting system, just to make sure my review is thorough. There was a brief pause on his end. I held my breath. It was the crucial moment. Yeah, fine. Whatever you need, he said dismissively. Just tell it I authorized it. I want this done right. Show me you're still the detail-oriented girl you used to be. I will. I promised. You won't regret this. I know, he said, the smugness radiating through the phone. He thought I was thanking him for the opportunity. I was thanking him for handing me the gun and the bullets. The 2 weeks that followed were the most intense of my life. My apartment became a nocturnal command center. By day, I was the dutiful consultant, sending polite, pointless summary reports to Mark on 10-year-old probate cases. By night, I was a digital archaeologist, digging through the firm's servers. The read-only access was all I needed. The evidence I already possessed was my roadmap. This new access was like having a live satellite feed. I could see everything in real time. I worked with a relentless, quiet fury. I wasn't just looking for more of the same. I was looking for patterns, for connections, for things that had happened after I was fired. And I found them. His sloppiness had grown with his confidence. I unearthed 14 new fraudulent invoices, all created in the last 2 months. One was from a geotechnical survey company that had a PAO box in the Bahamas, and no other digital footprint. I found 3 internal memos authorizing fund transfers that had been countersigned by a senior partner who, according to travel receipts I also found, was on a fly fishing trip in Montana on the dates in question. Every piece of new evidence was a nail. I downloaded everything, creating a second, updated dossier. This couldn't stay with me. If something happened, it would disappear. I needed a failsafe. I encrypted the entire file and sent it to Amelia Croft, a close friend from Colombia who was now a high-powered, take-no-prisoners litigator in Chicago. She was brilliant, discreet, and had a particular disdain for the entitled old boys club mentality that my father and brother embodied. My instructions to her were simple. Hold this. Don't open it unless you don't hear from me for 30 days, or until I give you the signal. She replied with a single, unambiguous word, held. I now had an armed and operational second front. I had the evidence, I had the backup, I had the witness, but it still wasn't enough. Any document can be challenged. Any data dismissed as forged by a disgruntled ex-employee. I needed one more thing, a confession. It didn't have to be a dramatic, tear-filled admission of guilt. It just had to be a single, undeniable statement from Mark, in writing, that corroborated a key piece of the fraud. An email. An email is a legal document. An email is forever. My plan was perfect in its simplicity. I had identified the weakest brick in his wall of lies, an account reconciliation from the Ridgefield project. He had fudged a number, a minor accounting discrepancy of a few $1,000s, to cover one of the smaller bribes. It was a tiny mistake, but it was a loose thread. My final move would be to pull on it, not with an accusation, but with a polite, professional query. I would frame it as a diligent consultant, simply trying to balance the books. I would ask an innocent question to which the only truthful answer was a lie, and the only lie available was an admission of guilt. I stared at my screen, the draft of my final, decisive email waiting. The trap was set, all the pieces were in place, the digital tripwires were laid, the legal leverage aligned. All that remained was to coax my arrogant brother into one last ruinous misstep. I would give him just enough opportunity, confident he would take it himself. The email sat in my drafts folder, a perfectly crafted instrument ready to be sent. I had spent the evening refining it, ensuring every word functioned like a precise, calibrated tool. My finger hovered over the send button, weeks of planning condensed into a single click. Then my phone buzzed, shattering the quiet of the room. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen there in months, Mark Jennings. My heart gave a single, hard jolt against my ribs. It was an involuntary, primal reaction, a fight-or-flight response honed by a lifetime of his casual cruelties. But then the training took over. The lawyer, the strategist, the woman with a fireproof safe full of evidence, asserted control. My mind raced. Why was he calling now? Had he discovered something? Did he suspect? No. His arrogance was a fortress. This was not a call of suspicion. It was a call of confidence. This was an opportunity. In the space of a single breath, I minimized the email draft, opened the pre-installed call recording application on my laptop, and clicked the bright red button. The digital timer began to tick upwards in silent. Crimson numbers. Only then did I answer the phone, pitching my voice to sound slightly tired, a little defeated. "Hello, Mark?" Clara working late. His voice was offensively cheerful, slick with the easy confidence of a man who had just closed a successful deal and was enjoying a celebratory scotch. "Listen, I've been thinking about your situation." I remained silent, letting him fill the space. It was a simple interrogation technique. People abhor a vacuum and will rush to fill it with words, often more than they should. "This consulting gig," he continued, "it's going well. You're doing good work, solid stuff. And I was talking to Dad. We think it's time to bring you back into the fold, for real this time." My fingers tightened on the edge of my desk. I could feel the faint tremor in my hand and willed it to stop. "What are you talking about?" "A permanent position. Dad thinks you'd be a natural fit for our public relations department, head of corporate communications. Maybe it's a senior role. You'd be great at it." The insult was so profound, so deeply ingrained in his worldview, that he didn't even recognize it. After 10 years of practicing law, of drafting briefs and managing compliance for his criminal enterprise, the best he could offer me was a position in PR, a soft role, a woman's role, a job for the helper. It was a gilded cage, a promotion into powerlessness. The rage was a hot flash, searing up my neck, but the voice that came out of my mouth was cool and weary. "PR, Mark. I'm a lawyer. And you'd still have the title. But this is about the family's image. Clara, it's about presenting a strong, united front. This is important work." Here it was, the opening. I let a long, calculated sigh travel down the line. "I don't know, Mark. It's a generous offer. It is. But my career, coming back to the firm after being fired, it's complicated." This was the bait. I wasn't appealing to his sense of justice, but to his desire to be seen as a magnanimous problem solver. I was presenting him with an obstacle that only he, in his great power, could remove. "It doesn't have to be complicated," he said, his tone shifting, becoming a caricature of a soothing, responsible older brother. "But it is," I insisted, injecting a note of fragile pride into my voice. "I can't just come back with that termination on my permanent record, the disruptive conduct charge. It would follow me forever. I can't accept. Not like that." I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He was so close to closing this loop, to tidying up the messy loose end of his disgraced sister. He just needed to make this one last little problem go away. "So what do you want?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. "A letter," I said softly. "Something signed by you, as acting partner. A formal letter for my internal file, and a copy for me, stating that my dismissal was the result of a professional misunderstanding that has since been fully resolved, that I'm being welcomed back with the firm's full confidence. If I had that, I would consider your offer." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a full 10 seconds. The recording software's timer ticked past the 2-minute mark. I could hear the faint clink of ice in his glass. He was weighing the options, the minor inconvenience of signing a letter versus the satisfaction of having his sister completely under his control, her career in his hands. As I knew he would, his ego made the decision for him. "Yeah, okay, I can do that," he said finally. "Of course, I can make that happen." Then came the hesitation I had been waiting for, the slight stumble that was the tell. "It's just, to make it all official, I'll need to go back and adjust some of the accounting entries from that period first, to make sure everything lines up with the misunderstanding narrative." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild bird. My entire body was screaming with triumph, but I forced my voice to remain a placid, curious whisper. "Adjust them." "What do you mean?" And then, he gave me everything. His voice was a low, conspiratorial murmur, the sound of a man who believed he was talking to a grateful and clueless subordinate. "You know," he said, and I could practically hear his condescending wink. "The stuff you were so worried about, those funds in the Ridgefield account, it was never a big deal. I was just moving some things around temporarily. That's all. A little creative bookkeeping to get the job done. No one was ever going to find out. It's just paperwork. I'll clean it up, make it all disappear, and then I'll sign your letter. Consider it done. I was moving some things around temporarily. No one was ever going to find out." The words echoed in the silent room. A perfect, crystalline confession. He had just admitted to intentional financial manipulation, to the entire scheme, in a single, arrogant breath. He had confessed to the crime in the process of trying to conceal it. I held on to my composure for another 30 seconds, murmuring my thanks, telling him I was grateful, that this meant the world to me. I ended the call, my hand steady. The moment the connection broke, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It came out as a ragged, shaky gasp. My hand flew to the mouse and I clicked, "Stop." The red timer froze. I saved the file, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed, "Exhibit B confession, wave." I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the quiet, sleeping city. The victory was so immense, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight. I had it, not just numbers on a page or suspicious documents, but his own voice, his own words, preserved in a digital file, were the final, irrefutable nail in his coffin. My first impulse was to send the file to Amelia, to call the district attorney's office, to burn it all to the ground right then and there, but I held back. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. Releasing it now would be an attack. It would be my word, my evidence, against his. The real victory would not be in exposing him. It would be in letting him expose himself. He thought he was safe. He thought he was in control. He was, at this very moment, smiling, swirling his scotch, proud of his own cleverness and generosity. And I would let him keep that feeling. I would let him clean up the books, blissfully unaware that I had a snapshot of the crime before his tampering. I would let him draft the letter exonerating me. I would let him prepare the PR job offer. The final blow is always the one your opponent never sees coming. It isn't delivered in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moment when they believe they have already won. Mark thought he was orchestrating my return. He had no idea he was simply setting the stage for his own spectacular, public implosion. And I knew the perfect occasion for the curtain to rise was coming. It would be sooner than he could ever imagine. The summons came via a formal calendar invitation from my father's assistant. Family meeting, it read, Wednesday, 10:00 a.m., main conference room. They had given me a week to bask in the warmth of their supposed generosity. A week for Mark to adjust his creative accounting. A week for them to believe they had successfully brought the stray back into the fold. They thought this meeting was about my future. They had no idea it was about their past. I arrived at precisely 9:55 a.m. The main conference room at Jennings & Sons was my father's cathedral of power. It was a long, cavernous space dominated by a 20-foot mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling library of leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been opened in a generation. The opposite wall was a sheet of glass offering a panoramic view of the Ridgefield skyline, a view paid for, in part, by my brother's slush fund. The air smelled of old leather, furniture polish, and an unshakable sense of male entitlement. My father was already seated at the head of the table, his posture regal, a king surveying his domain. Mark sat at his right hand, the designated heir, looking smug and relaxed in a suit that cost more than my car. He had the letter, the one exonerating me, in a neat leather portfolio in front of him. It was his centerpiece, his proof of magnanimity. They had left the chair to my father's left empty for me, the traditional place of a subordinate seeking favor. I ignored it. Instead, I walked around the table and took a seat directly opposite them, placing my laptop on the gleaming wood. It was a subtle but clear repositioning. I was not here to petition. I was here to preside. My father cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Clara, thank you for coming. As you know, Mark has been doing an exceptional job steering the firm's growth. We've had a banner year. He nodded toward Mark, a gesture of profound paternal pride. After careful consideration, and in light of his continued success, I am formally announcing my intention to transition Mark into the role of managing partner, effective at the end of the fiscal year. He paused, expecting a reaction. I gave him none. I opened a leather-bound notepad, uncapped a fountain pen, and began taking notes as if I were in a deposition. The steady, silent scratching of the nib on paper was the only sound. This unnerved them. They were prepared for emotion gratitude for the PR job, perhaps a flicker of sibling jealousy. They were not prepared for calm, dispassionate procedure. Mark, ever the performer, leaned forward, a condescending smile playing on his lips. Dad is right. We've had a great year, and we're glad you're going to be a part of it again. Clara, in your own way. He looked at our father, then back at me. My sister has always been excellent with files. Dad, meticulous. But she can't carry the weight of this firm. She doesn't have the stomach for the hard decisions. The insult hung in the air, thick and oily. He was framing me as a glorified secretary, a detail-oriented but ultimately powerless accessory to their success. He believed he was delivering the final, gentle put-down, cementing his dominance before benevolently handing me my consolation prize. He was smiling, just as I knew he would be. It was the perfect moment. I stopped writing. I carefully placed my pen down, perfectly parallel to the notepad. I looked up, meeting my brother's gaze for the first time, and held it. My voice, when it came, was not angry, not loud, but quiet and cold as a tombstone. That's probably because I've never had a chance to look closely at your files. Mark. The effect was instantaneous. The smug, relaxed atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. Mark's smile didn't vanish. It froze, becoming a brittle, unnatural thing. My father, who had been leaning back in his chair, slowly straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew my tone. It was not the voice of his daughter. It was the voice of a litigator who has just spotted a fatal flaw in the opposition's testimony. In the ringing silence, I said nothing more. I turned my laptop around to face them. I didn't need to say a word. I simply reached out and plugged the HDMI cable into the port on the table. With a soft click, the laptop's screen was mirrored on the 80-inch monitor on the far wall, the one they used for client presentations and video conferences. The first image that appeared was a high-resolution scan of a single document. It was the internal charter for the J&S Internal Emergency Fund. At the bottom of the page were 2 lines for authorization. One was for my father, the other for Mark. Mark's signature, a flamboyant, arrogant scrawl, was clear as day. My father squinted at the screen. "What is this? Some kind of reserve account?" I didn't answer him. I simply tapped the arrow key. The screen changed to a detailed ledger, a spreadsheet. On the left were dates and client account numbers. In the middle were withdrawal amounts. On the right, the destination, the J&S Internal Emergency Fund, billions of dollars, flowing in. Then I tapped the key again. A new spreadsheet, the fund's expenditures, payments to shell corporations with names like East Coast Logistical Solutions and New Hampshire Strategic Consulting. Payments listed as community outreach, made directly to the private accounts of city officials. I heard a sharp intake of breath from my father. Finally, I navigated to one last file. It was a scan of a withdrawal authorization for $50,000 from the Ridgefield account, justified as an expert geological consultation. At the bottom, in the space for the compliance manager's approval, was my own signature, a clumsy, digitized forgery. I used the mouse to circle it in bright, blood red. "What is this?" my father repeated, but this time his voice was different. The confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, strained whisper. His face, usually ruddy with health and success, had become a pale, waxy mask. He was looking at the screen, but his eyes were seeing the abyss opening up beneath his feet. I finally turned my gaze from the screen to him. My expression was neutral, my voice devoid of triumph or malice. "It's the truth," I said, my words dropping like stones into the silence. "And it's my real birthday gift to you." The spell was broken. Mark shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward on the polished floor. The handsome, charming mask was gone, replaced by a contorted face of pure panic and rage. His carefully constructed world was dissolving into pixels on a screen, and he was cornered. "She stole that," he yelled, his voice cracking. He wasn't speaking to me, but to our father, a desperate appeal to his last ally. "That's privileged company data. She hacked the system. I'll sue you. I'll sue you into oblivion. You hear me? I'll have you disbarred." He was babbling, threatening a lawsuit for theft of data that proved his own grand larceny. He wasn't denying its authenticity. In his panic, he was confirming it. I did not respond. I simply sat there, my hands folded on the table in front of me, and watched. I watched the edifice of Jennings and Sons, built on a foundation of chauvinism and lies, begin to crumble under the weight of a few simple, undeniable numbers. I watched my father stare at the screen, the dawning horror in his eyes, as he finally understood the true nature of the son he had chosen. And I watched my brother, the golden heir, reduced to a sputtering, threatening mess, exposed for the common criminal he truly was. The meeting was over. The verdict was in. Mark's shouts echoed off the glass and polished mahogany of the conference room, a chaotic, desperate sound that filled the vacuum my silence had created. He was a cornered animal, spitting and clawing, threatening lawsuits and ruin. It was all noise, all meaningless. I watched him, not with anger or contempt, but with a kind of detached pity. He still thought the loudest voice in the room was the one with the most power. He had learned nothing. I ignored him completely. My focus was on my father, who sat as if turned to stone, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, while Mark continued to rage. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved the small, black USB drive, the original, the one that had been nestled behind our family's past. I held it between my thumb and forefinger and, with a steady hand, slid it across the vast, gleaming table. It moved almost silently, a tiny black vessel carrying an ocean of truth, coming to a stop directly in front of my father's folded hands. The sound of its gentle impact was louder than all of Mark's yelling. "The data on the screen is a copy," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Mark's tirade faltered. "This is the original, Dad, Exhibit A, the one I took from the firm's server before I was fired, the one I brought into this building today. You can verify the metadata yourself. You can confirm the timestamps. You can see that it hasn't been altered." For a long moment, my father did not move. He stared at the tiny piece of plastic as if it were a venomous snake. Then, with a hand that trembled visibly, he reached for it, his fingers, usually so steady and sure, fumbled for a moment before closing around it. He looked from the drive to me, and in his eyes, I saw the last flicker of denial die. He was a lawyer. He understood the sanctity of an unbroken chain of evidence. He turned to his personal laptop, his movements stiff and clumsy. He opened it, and the process of his own world unraveling began. He inserted the drive. The file directory popped up, a neat list of folders and documents. I watched his face as he began to click through them. He didn't need to perform a deep forensic analysis. The truth was right there on the surface. He opened a PDF of a bank statement from the slush fund. He opened a scanned invoice from one of the Bahamian shell corporations, and then he opened a folder labeled Authorizations. Forged. He clicked on the first file. It was a transfer of funds from the Harrison Trust account. At the bottom was Mark's signature, and next to it, the clumsy forgery of my own. His breath hitched. He clicked the next one, and the next, and the next. With every click, another piece of his legacy crumbled. He was not just seeing a crime. He was seeing a pattern of deep, calculated betrayal perpetrated by the son he had anointed. He was seeing his own name, the Jennings name that he had built into a symbol of integrity and power, being used as a tool for common thieves. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind the papery, translucent skin of a very old, very broken man. While he was lost in his digital nightmare, I spoke again, my voice low and even. "I am not here to destroy this company," I said, directing my words to the shell of the man my father had become. "I am here to save it. I am saving it from the person who is actively destroying it from the inside out. The name on that door means something to me. Even if I was never meant to be a part of it, I wouldn't let him burn it down to fund his ego." Mark, seeing his father's utter collapse, made one last, pathetic lunge for salvation. "Dad, look at me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's framing me. She's a disgruntled employee. She was fired. She fabricated all of this to get back at us." My father did not look at him. He did not even seem to hear him. His eyes remained fixed on the screen of his laptop, on the endless scroll of his son's sins. That silence was Mark's true conviction. It was a silent, paternal judgment more final than any court could ever deliver. My work here was done. The truth was now a guest at their table, and I would leave the three of them to get acquainted. Slowly, deliberately, I began to pack my things. I disconnected the HDMI cable, the screen on the wall going black, plunging the room into a somber, shadowed state. I closed my laptop. The soft click of the lid, a sound of absolute finality. I slid it into its sleeve and placed it in my briefcase, alongside my notepad and pen. I snapped the latches shut, the metallic clicks echoing in the tense silence. I stood up. Neither of them looked at me. My father was a statue of grief. Mark was a pillar of panic. I walked around the table, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. As I passed my father's chair, I paused. I leaned down, my voice a whisper meant only for him, a final, private testament. A daughter doesn't need to inherit the business. Father, I said, the words clear and sharp, she just needs to not disgrace the name. I straightened up and continued toward the door without looking back. I had my hand on the heavy brass handle when I heard it. First, the violent scrape of a chair being shoved away from the table. Then, my father's voice, no longer a whisper, but a raw, guttural roar of command, a sound I had not heard since I was a child, a sound of absolute, unquestionable authority. Enough, Mark. That was it. That was the victory. It wasn't in the data. It wasn't in the confession. It was in those two words. It was the sound of an axis shifting, of a lifetime of blind favoritism shattering in a single moment. He had made his choice. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing it gently behind me. I did not need to stay to witness the fallout. I did not need to hear the apologies, the excuses, or the recriminations. I had won this war not with clever tricks or legal maneuvering, but with the simple, brutal weight of the truth. I had placed that truth on the table in the heart of their kingdom and walked away. The rest was just the inevitable, messy process of their own self-destruction. I had no interest in watching that. My gift had been delivered. The 3 weeks following the meeting in the conference room were defined by an unnerving, absolute silence. It was as if I had thrown a boulder into a deep, dark lake and was left waiting for the ripples to reach my shore. There were no angry phone calls, no pleading emails, no emissaries of the family sent to negotiate a truce. There was nothing. It was the silence of a dynasty in shock, of a king locked in his tower, contemplating the ruins of his kingdom. I did not spend that time waiting. I updated my resume. I reconnected with old colleagues from my first law firm, and I took long walks through the crisp New England autumn, feeling the cold air on my face, a welcome antidote to the suffocating atmosphere of my family's world. For the first time in my life, I was not waiting for their approval or their anger. I was simply living. The silence was finally broken not by a whisper, but by a roar. It came on a Tuesday morning. I was in a small downtown cafe, nursing a latte and reading a novel, when I saw it on the front page of the New Hampshire Chronicle. Folded on the table next to mine, the headline was stark, black, and brutal. Jennings & Sons under investigation for financial irregularities, and beneath it, a large professional headshot of my brother. The photo was a few years old, taken when his ambition was at its zenith. He was smiling, his eyes full of the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. Now, juxtaposed with that headline, his confidence looked like the height of foolishness, his smile a self-incriminating smirk. I bought a copy. I sat back down and read the article, my coffee growing cold. The language was cautious, full of legal euphemisms, a source close to the investigation, allegations of a significant internal fund, potential misuse of client trusts, the official statement from the firm, provided by some high-priced crisis management team, was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. It mentioned a thorough internal review, and stated that Mark Jennings was taking a voluntary leave of absence to cooperate fully with the relevant authorities. I had to admire the artistry. A voluntary leave of absence was such a delicate, civilized way of saying he had been cast into exile. The article was a sanitized, public-facing version of the carnage I had unleashed in that conference room, but the message was the same. The boulder had hit the bottom of the lake, and the tidal wave was just beginning. The first ripple reached me directly the following day. My phone rang, displaying the name of a prestigious Boston law firm. Sloan, Decker and Pierce, they were one of the old giants, a firm my father both envied and respected. I answered, my voice a model of professional calm. It was Arthur Sloan himself, the senior managing partner. Ms. Jennings, he said, his voice a smooth, baritone hum of old money and legal authority. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all. Miss Sloan? Good. I will be direct. We've been following the recent news concerning your former firm. It's an unfortunate situation. He paused, a master of the dramatic beat. We at Sloan, Decker are in the process of expanding our compliance division. We are looking for a new department head, someone with unimpeachable integrity and experience navigating complex internal environments. The unspoken words hung in the air between us. We know you were the whistleblower. We know you had the courage to do what was right, even at great personal cost. That is precisely what we want to hire. He would never say it, of course, but he didn't have to. My disruptive conduct, the very thing I was fired for, had just become my most valuable professional asset. The beautiful, exquisite irony of it was not lost on me. I see, I said, allowing a small, genuine smile to touch my lips. I would be very interested in discussing that opportunity. Mr. Sloan. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, the silence returning, but this time it felt different. It was no longer the silence of suspense, but the silence of quiet, profound satisfaction. I had not just survived, I was about to thrive. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mark, his first communication since the meeting. The words on the screen were dripping with childish, self-pitying rage. Are you happy now? I looked at the message for a long time. It was the question of a man who still believed this was all about my feelings, about some petty sibling rivalry. He couldn't comprehend that this was about facts, about laws, about the truth. A simple yes felt too crude. A no felt like a lie. My happiness wasn't the point. Their atonement was. So I typed a reply that was both honest and a strategic power play. That depends on what Dad says at the press conference tomorrow. I hit send. The response put the burden squarely back on them. It told him that this was not over. It told him that my silence, my cooperation, my potential mercy, all of it was conditional upon a public act of contrition. The press conference was held the next day in the lobby of the Jennings & Sons building. I watched it on a live news feed on my laptop. The space was packed with reporters, a feeding frenzy of cameras and microphones. And then my father walked to the podium. He looked 10 years older. The bespoke suit that usually fit him like a second skin now seemed to hang off his frame. The formidable patriarch was gone, replaced by a tired, diminished man. He began by reading from a prepared statement, his voice tight and strained. He spoke of the firm's long history, its commitment to its clients, its deep regret over the current situation. He pledged full cooperation with the investigation. It was all standard, predictable damage control. Then, he put the papers down. He gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white, and looked directly into the sea of cameras. His voice, when he spoke again, was his own. It was raw, and for the first time in my memory, it was vulnerable. These investigations were prompted by an internal audit, he said, his gaze unflinching. The financial irregularities in question were first brought to my attention by my daughter, Clara Jennings. A murmur went through the crowd. The cameras flashed in a blinding, percussive storm. He held up a hand for silence. Her integrity in this matter, her courage to speak the truth, even when it was difficult, has, in a very real sense, saved the honor of this firm. She acted to protect our clients and the legacy that bears our family name. I, owe her a debt of gratitude that can never truly be repaid." He stood there for a moment longer, blinking against the flashbulbs. An old king who had just publicly abdicated his pride. The reporters began shouting questions, but I no longer heard them. I was focused on 2 words he had spoken. My daughter. He hadn't said Clara, the name of a problem to be managed. He had said, my daughter, the title of a relationship, a public claiming of kinship and respect I had craved my entire life. I closed my laptop. The shouting from the news feed was cut off, leaving my apartment in sudden, profound silence. He had done it, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of public humiliation. He had finally given me the one thing I had always wanted: an acknowledgement. It wasn't a loving embrace in the privacy of a family home. It was a calculated statement in the middle of a corporate crisis. But it was real. It was another gift, a late gift, a tarnished one, born of ruin and necessity. But as I sat there, the afternoon sun streaming through my window, I knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was enough. Months bled into a new year, each passing day solidifying the new reality. My life had moved to Boston, to a corner office at Sloan, Decker and Pierce with a view of the harbor. My work was challenging. My colleagues respected me, and the name Jennings, when spoken in these hallways, was associated with my own merit, not with my father's legacy or my brother's disgrace. The storm in New Hampshire had passed, leaving behind the quiet, tedious work of legal proceedings and corporate restructuring. I had followed the news from a distance, an interested but emotionally detached observer. Mark had been indicted. My father had stepped down, selling his majority stake in the firm to a larger consortium. The N Sons had been quietly removed from the company name. It was all happening exactly as the logic of the situation dictated. Then, one brisk March afternoon, he found me. I was in a small coffee shop near my apartment, a quiet place with worn wooden floors and the rich, comforting smell of roasted beans. I had my laptop open, but I was just staring out the window, watching people hurry by, their faces bundled in scarves against the wind. A shadow fell over my table. I looked up, and my breath caught in my chest. It was Mark, but it was a version of him I had never seen before. The outline of the man was familiar, but the substance was gone. He was thin, unnervingly so. The expensive wool coat that had once been a symbol of his power and status now hung on his frame, looking like a costume borrowed from a larger, more confident man. His face was gaunt. His skin had a pale, unhealthy pallor, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a dull, haunted emptiness. He looked like a man who hadn't truly slept in months. He didn't ask if he could sit. He simply pulled out the opposite chair and sank into it, his movements slow and exhausted. He placed his hands on the table. I noticed they were trembling slightly. For a long moment, we just sat there. The ambient noise of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, the clink of ceramic on saucer filling the space between us. He didn't seem to know where to begin. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of confident words, and now he had none left. Finally, he looked at me, though his gaze seemed to be focused on a point somewhere just past my shoulder. His voice, when it came, was a dry, raspy whisper, a ghost of the booming, self-assured tone he once possessed. "You won," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact, a conclusion he had reached after countless sleepless nights. I lost everything, the firm, the house, my license, everything. I listened to the words, but I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of victory. The scene I had imagined for years, this moment of his final, absolute defeat, was playing out before me, and the only thing I felt was a profound and weary quiet. He still saw it as a game, a contest between siblings. He still didn't understand that he hadn't lost to me. He had lost to himself. "No," I replied. my voice steady and low. It was important that he understood this. It was the only part of the truth that still mattered. I didn't win. Mark, you threw it all away. You threw it away yourself, just like you threw away that photograph I gave Dad. The analogy hit him with a physical force. His gaze, which had been distant and unfocused, snapped to mine. For a flicker of a second, I saw a flash of the old Mark, the anger, the defensiveness, but it died as quickly as it appeared, extinguished by the crushing weight of his reality. His eyes fell. He stared down at his trembling hands on the table, and his entire body seemed to shrink. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping forward in a gesture of utter unconditional surrender. He said nothing. And in that silence, I found my victory. It wasn't in his words of defeat. It was in his complete inability to offer a defense. An apology would have been easy. Excuses would have been his natural reflex. But this silent, all-consuming shame, this was real. This was the confession I had never expected, more potent and more honest than any words he could ever speak. We sat in that silence for another minute. He, lost in the wreckage of his life. I, watching him, feeling the last vestiges of a lifetime of resentment dissolve, not into forgiveness, but into a calm, cold finality. This was the end of the story. I reached into my handbag, which was resting on the seat beside me. My fingers found the small, rectangular object I had started carrying with me. Though I wasn't entirely sure why, I pulled it out and placed it on the table between us. It was a simple, inexpensive black frame, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Inside was a 4x6 copy of the restored photograph. My father, my mother, a cocky teenage boy, and a gap-toothed little girl. A family that no longer existed. I gently pushed it across the table toward him. His head was still bowed. He didn't see it at first. "Mark," I said softly. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He saw the photograph. He flinched, as if expecting it to burn him. "Keep it," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "It's just a copy. You should have something to remember her by. She loved you, too." The mention of our mother was the one thing that could still breach his defenses. His face, which had been a mask of numb despair, suddenly crumpled. His throat worked, and a choked, guttural sound escaped him. He looked from the photograph to my face, and his eyes filled with a galaxy of unshed tears. It was the look of a lost little boy who had just been reminded of the one person in the world whose love had been unconditional, and whose memory he had so thoroughly disgraced. He didn't take the photo. He couldn't seem to bring himself to touch it. He just stared at it, the silent testament to all he had squandered. Then, with a shuddering breath, he pushed himself to his feet. He gave me one last, broken look, a look that was a chaotic mixture of hatred, shame, and a sliver of something that might have been gratitude. Then he turned and walked away, weaving through the tables like a man in a dream, and disappeared out the door into the cold afternoon. I was left alone at the table with the small, framed photograph. The low, golden sunlight of the late afternoon slanted through the window, catching the glass of the frame and sending a warm reflection across the wood grain of the table. I picked it up, looking at the smiling faces from a life I could barely remember. I thought he would come here to apologize, to beg, to rage one last time. But he had done none of those things. He had simply shown me the truth of his defeat. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to hear the words, "I'm sorry." I never had. His silence, his shame, his inability to even meet my eyes, that was the only apology that could ever have mattered. His absolute, soul-crushing silence was the clearest victory I could have ever achieved. A year later. The stage was different, but the feeling of being watched was the same. I was in the grand ballroom of a Boston hotel, standing at a sleek, modern lectern under the warm glow of professional stage lighting. Before me, a sea of faces, hundreds of executives, lawyers, and compliance officers were gathered for the annual Northeast Symposium on Corporate Ethics. I was the keynote speaker, my name, Clara Jennings, was no longer a footnote in my family's story. It was now a brand, synonymous with integrity and the high cost of its absence. I had spent an hour walking them through the sterile, impersonal case studies and legal frameworks of my new life's work. I spoke of transparency, accountability, and the critical importance of a robust corporate conscience. It was all true, all necessary, but it was also a shield, a professional armor I wore to cover the deeply personal war that had forged it. As I prepared to conclude, the moderator, a polished woman with a warm, television-ready smile, stood to ask one final question. "Ms. Jennings, that was incredibly insightful." "Thank you," she began, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "You've become such a powerful and respected voice in this field in a remarkably short time. People in this room look up to you. Could you share with us what first set you on this path? What was the catalyst that made you dedicate your career to this specific, and often difficult, work?" She was asking for my origin story. The audience leaned forward, hungry for a personal anecdote, a glimpse behind the professional facade. I paused. The answer they expected was something about a mentor, a challenging case, a philosophical revelation in law school. My truth was far stranger, far simpler. I took a breath and leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a more intimate, conversational tone. "A trash can," I said, "and the wrong lesson." A ripple of confused, polite laughter spread through the front rows. They thought I was making a joke. My expression remained unchanged, my gaze steady. The laughter died, replaced by a deep, expectant silence. "As a child," I continued, my voice even and cold, "I was taught a lesson, that a son's role is to build a legacy, and a daughter's role is to support it, that a man's value is measured in assets and acquisitions, and a woman's value is measured in her loyalty and sentiment. For years, I believed that was the price of admission to my own family. I tried to pay it." The room was utterly still. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick hotel carpet. Then, one day, I gave a gift. It was a gift of sentiment, of memory, of love, a thing of no monetary value, and I watched as it was dismissed, and then discarded, thrown into the trash alongside the leftover cake from a birthday party. The camera feed on the large screens on either side of the stage zoomed in on my face. I wasn't looking at the audience in the room anymore. I was looking into the dark lens of the center camera, speaking to a different audience, one of two people who I knew would be watching this somewhere. "They threw away the gift I gave them," I said, my voice resonating with a final quiet power. "But they didn't realize what they were really throwing away. They were throwing away their one and only chance for forgiveness." My right hand, which had been resting on the side of the lectern, moved to the center. My fingers curled around a small, simple black frame, the same one I had placed on the table in the coffee shop months ago. It held the image of my mother's smile, a silent, eternal witness. The spotlight on the stage tightened around me, casting the rest of the room into shadow. There was only me, the podium, and the memory in my hand. I looked directly into the camera one last time, my expression unreadable, my voice a final, clean cut. "He threw away the wrong gift." The stage lights went to black. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, the sound of applause began, growing from a few scattered claps into a thunderous, sustained ovation that filled the darkness. The story was over. There would be no epilogue. There were no more words to say. The revenge was complete, and its perfection was in its silence. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And you can provide even more support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.